Hello, comrades. Welcome everybody to this session. Today we're starting a sort of mini series within our series looking at the rise of fascism in Europe. That's quite a big session, quite a big subject, so we've divided it up a little bit. Today we're starting with Kevin giving an introduction to the background of the political situation in Europe before the rise of fascism, which obviously played a huge role in the rise of fascism. Then next week, David Broder is going to look at the rise of fascism in Italy before Kevin comes back to look at the rise of fascism in Germany. And I understand we might squeeze in another session then into the schedule, but we're going to discuss that. So that might push everything a little back 1 week. But we're very pleased to welcome Kevin again to start this section in our educational series looking at fascism. Thank you very much for joining us, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, comrades. Good evening, everybody. Fascism is, I suppose, a very important topic. It's something which, in a way, casts a very long shadow over the years, not only before the Second World War, but in the years following that. And for those of us that grew up perhaps closer to the Second World War than other comrades, it's really a part of our lives and the part of the lives of the people that we grew up amongst. I think it's very important, though, to be very clear about the nature of fascism, and in particular to look at it both as a sort of concrete historical movement and a particular period in European and indeed world history, but also to use that then as a basis for discussing contemporary fascism, and in particular the possibilities of the re-emergence of fascism. And what I hope over the next 3 sessions is that I and other comrades will look at that. Look at the concrete historical questions of the nature of fascism, and particularly try to get to some of the the confusions that have been thrown up around what fascism actually is. Throughout my political life, references have been made to all sorts of right-wing, conservative, and indeed military dictatorships and others that have been described as fascist. Even quite mainstream conservative politicians were described as fascist. I remember Eric Heffer in the late 70s describing Margaret Thatcher as a stocking-footed fascist, and the term fascist being applied to all sorts of right-wing politicians that we didn't like. And of course, in the contemporary period, we get this debate around Trump. Now, tonight, I don't particularly want to talk about that because I think that will come up in some of the other sessions. But I want to talk a little bit about the background to fascism in post-First World War Europe, but also to talk about some of the antecedents of fascism, but also to maybe just touch on some of the debates that occur about the nature of fascism, both amongst the left, but also perhaps just as importantly for us, the debates in bourgeois society and how bourgeois commentators have attempted to distance capitalism and so-called liberal democracy from fascism, and in a sense to try to distinguish between the capitalist system and fascism. So that's really where I want to begin. First of all, then, I want to look at the immediate period after the end of the First World War. And as you'll gather from Roger Silverman and Hillel Tichting's talks about the Russian Revolution, this is a revolutionary period throughout Europe. The map of Europe is transformed. The old empires disappear. They're overthrown by revolutionary nationalist and by socialist movements. In Germany, of course, we have the German Revolution. We have the abdication of the Kaiser, and and really a revolutionary potential that exists in Germany. We also have the dissolution of other empires, the Habsburg Empire in Central Europe, the emergence of nationalist movements. So really a complete transformation of the map of Europe, which points, I think, to a revolutionary potential. And certainly, as we know from previous talks, the Bolsheviks and others believed that they, and quite accurately, they believed that they were in a revolutionary period. And like 1848, like in 1848, we have a revolution spreading throughout Europe. Much of Europe then is seized by revolutionary movements, strikes, workers occupying their factories, the disintegration of old states, the emergence of new states, and the growth of serious revolutionary challenges to capitalism. So this, in many ways, is the absolute background to the growth of the counter-revolution that we've come to know as fascism. So this period from 1918 into the early 20s, in Italy 1922, in Germany slightly longer, 1923, but there's then a further revolutionary period in the late 1920s. So if we look at the impact of that war and we think about what was created, the challenge to capitalist society came obviously from the working class. It came from workers' demands, not only for an end to war, but also for a different society, that capitalism as a system had shown itself to be thoroughly rotten and shown itself to be capable of transformation in that war. The potential for a new society was very clearly there. And also the forces that could carry out that transformation were clearly there in the form of the working class. But that war also produced other effects that affected wider sections of society. It affected not only the urban working class populations, but also broad sections of the rural populations. And in those countries in Central Europe, which had a very large petty bourgeois, a middle class, it also affected them. And so if we're going to look at the emergence of fascism, we need to look at those groups as well. We need to look at the impact of war on the soldiers who are returning home. We need to look at the impact of war and its wider effects on the rural populations, on the small business people. For example, in Germany, which is one of the defeated powers in that war, we have the great inflation of 1923, a product of the reparations crisis when the victorious powers imposed reparations on the defeated Germany, and that resulted in inflation, an absolutely catastrophic inflation that wiped out the savings and indeed the businesses of many sections of the petty bourgeoisie. We also have similar sorts of dislocations as a result of the declining empires, of changes in land ownership throughout Central Europe. And of course, we have then the underlying problems in other countries like Italy, whose national reunification had occurred in 1870. But there were still many historic tasks left behind. There was still the great divisions between the south of Italy, the Mezzogiorno, the areas that were most backward in development, and then the more industrialized and the more developed north. So we have in post-war Europe a revolutionary period, a period in which capitalism really felt itself under threat. And not only do we have the disintegrations of the old empire, but we also have these new challenges. So we have a society in ferment. And in that type of ferment, all sorts of new forms are going to emerge. Now, in some of our other sessions, and indeed when I come to talk about Nazism and German fascism a little later on. We'll look a little more at the working class movement. But I want to look at the nature of this ferment amongst the petty bourgeoisie and indeed the wider classes that are emerging out of the chaos of the war. And in particular, I want to try to discuss how they try to orientate in this new world. Now, socialists from the late 19th century had discussed the role of intermediate classes. Indeed, the German socialists, when they first began to formulate their program, had a very hot debate about whether other classes in society, other than the proletariat, could form historically progressive groups. And it was very clear, as Marxists had interpreted in the 19th century, that between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, there were a whole series of intermediate groups, leaving aside the rural populations who could often be brought in as a reactionary or counter-revolutionary force. This would certainly be the case in terms of French history. But what many socialists understood was that the petty bourgeoisie were a class that vacillated, that there was actually a potential to win that class over to the labor movement, over to the working class movement. And if they were small farmers or small business people, then their position under capitalism was one in which they would be squeezed, they would become increasingly proletarianized, and that their real interest lay not with the established order, but actually lay with the proletariat. Now, it's this class, it's this group that in many ways are the important bedrock of the fascist movement. But it isn't just that this class are a sort of autonomous group that are moving around. It's also that this class throws up and indeed develops ideologies in themselves, developed from or drawn from capitalism. So if we're trying to interpret fascism, we've got to look not just at the role of the bourgeoisie, but we also have to look at the role of the petty bourgeoisie as well. Much of the academic and indeed the historical debate on the nature of fascism has really turned on this issue of the relationship between the bourgeoisie and these later fascist movements. And indeed, there's a whole school of the literature which attempts to see fascism as an autonomous movement. Indeed, one of the works that I've cited on the reading list, Griffin, not necessarily his reader, but some of his other more analytical work, suggests that fascism is a type of autonomous revolutionary movement. And this, I think, is an important strand in the debate because it indicates a fairly widespread view that sees the fascist period as, in some senses, distinct from liberal capitalism. Now, that's true in one sense. It's true that that capitalism in a stable period would prefer to rule through bourgeois democracy. But what it also tends to do is to separate the role of the capitalist class and indeed the state and the established order in generally from fascism. And as David next week will discuss, and as I will discuss later on, it's essentially the mainstream bourgeois parties who assist the fascists to power. It's the state, it's the armed forces, it's the church, it's the real centers of power that act to bring in fascists and Nazis into power. So the idea then of Nazis seizing power, the idea of Mussolini, for example, marching on Rome and seizing power, is a fallacy. Essentially, we're looking at the role of the bourgeois state, we're looking at the role of capitalism in assisting and bringing the fascists to power. And that's because in many senses, this attempt to distance capitalism from fascism is a product, I think, of the post-war world. The horrors of fascism, the horrors of the Second World War, the horrors of the Nazi extermination program of the Jewish and other populations of Europe obviously will mean that the established order wants to draw a distinction from that. But it's also because in many ways, ideologically, fascism draws its inspiration from what are quite mainstream ideas in bourgeois society. So that, for example, if we look at the scientific racism that underpins much Nazi and fascist ideology, particularly Nazi ideology, we see that having considerable overlap with imperialist ideology. We see it having considerable overlap with the practice of pre-First World War regimes. We see it in the racism of European colonies towards their subject peoples. We also see it in the ideologies that lie in 19th century social Darwinism, a very vulgar application of Darwinian evolutionary theory to society, the idea of the survival of the fittest, which isn't exactly what Darwin said, but what's a matter of scientific precision when it comes to an ideology like fascism. It's the idea of race, the idea of an essential racism. These ideas are quite commonplace. Indeed, I remember when I taught this some 20 or 30 years ago, when I began to introduce this topic to my students, I gave them a set of selections of both Nazi, fascist, and British imperialist writers. And invariably, my students identified, I didn't put the names by them, but invariably, my students identified the racist rantings of Adolf Hitler, the racist language of Winston Churchill in talking about the British Empire. They identified that with Adolf Hitler. So many of these ideologies that we're discussing draw from quite mainstream bourgeois ideas. But there's, of course, another element, not just the ideological element here. There's also, I think, some of the politics of the mass movement. Because what I've been trying to stress in terms of the social classes from which fascism drew its support is, of course, the role of the petty bourgeoisie. And in particular, the existence of these mass movements that will later not only challenge the working class movement, but will then assume state power as well. Many of these movements have parallels, and indeed I would say some organizational origins in the period long before the post-First World War period. So, for example, we can see, and Trotsky in particular, in his discussion on the relationship between fascism and Bonapartism, we can see some comparisons in the way that Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, comrades will again remember our discussions of that in some of the earlier sessions, in the period after the 1848 revolution. We will see his mobilization of a section of the urban population, the Bohemians, the déclassés, the various flotsam and jetsam of capitalist society, the former soldiers, the various people who've in a sense been affected by the crisis, combined with the rural population to create a mass movement of this Bonapartism that Napoleon III is able to build on. But there are also other movements in the later 19th century. Georges Belanger, his movement in the 1880s has some of the characteristics of fascism. Again, a movement of the petit bourgeois, a focus on uniting the nation, of bringing together the disparate forces. And indeed, a movement that develops from a sense of crisis, both the crisis from the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, but also in the corruption of the French Third Republic. And of course, we have probably the most important for our discussions in terms of Germany, the movements in the Habsburg Empire of so-called Christian socialism, and in particular movements that mobilize the petty bourgeoisie and some sections of the unemployed in Vienna, Georg von Schöneberg, Karl Lueger, and others who develop a type of movement that's founded on racism, particularly anti-Semitism, which push forward this idea that the essence of the nation must be protected, and in particular can develop an autonomous movement that counters the growing socialist movement, and indeed will then be used by sections of the bourgeoisie for their own particular political purposes. Now, if we see the antecedents of these ideas, if we see ideas of race, if we see the ideas of the strong man, Georges Belanger is a good example, Louis Napoleon, the various other leaders, we can see these ideas clearly, make their mark. But these ideas can only take on a mass form when society is really facing a very severe crisis. So we don't just have the ideology. We're not just talking about a set of reactionary ideas of racism, of social Darwinism, of the nation, of the idea of cross-class unity. We're not just talking about that. We're also talking about the possibility that those ideas can be mobilized in a particular crisis. And of course, that is the sort of crisis that emerges after 1918. And it occurs particularly in the defeated powers. But of course, in the case of Italy, Italy isn't a defeated power. Italy is one of the victorious powers. But it is a society which has many deep social divisions, in which its unification is not really complete, in which there is a vibrant and very strong revolutionary working class movement, which I'm sure David will discuss next week, the factory occupations, the growth of a very militant movement. So we have to look at the ideology in relation to the crisis, that we're not looking just simply at a set of ideas, we're looking at how that might relate to a particular crisis, and particularly the crisis of particular social classes. Now, I want to just round up this sort of very short introduction by looking at some of the ways that this has been theorized, and particularly by discussing the ways that it's sometimes raised today, and particularly looking at some of the key features of fascism. I've said that that there is a school of bourgeois academic that sees fascism as a revolutionary movement. Indeed, some who argue that it emerges from the left. A lot is made of the fact that the Nazis called themselves Nationalsozialist, that they were national socialists, or that Mussolini had been on the far left of the Italian Socialist Party. And also they sort of point at the way that many of the fascist movements were opposed to aspects of bourgeois society. But I think that this emphasis overstates both the autonomy of those movements, but also it overstates the limits from within which they work. And so far from them being genuinely revolutionary, they all work within the confines of capitalism. And of course, as we say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. When those movements come to power, as is the case with Italian fascism and with German Nazism, when they come to power, they essentially uphold capitalism. And indeed, although state power is handed over to the Nazis, and also gradually in Italy as well, from 22 to 29, state power is handed over to the fascists. Economic power remains in the hands of the ruling class. The other aspect that I wanted to perhaps draw on, and because it's perhaps more relevant now to us in this period, is that labeling of all sorts of authoritarian movements, and indeed of right-wing politicians, as fascist. And indeed of arguing that all sorts of reactionary ideas of racism and so on essentially are the precursor to fascism. Now, I think the key point about fascism is not necessarily its ideology. It's actually its nature as a social movement, and above all, its nature as a movement whose aim is to destroy the organized working class. Again, if we look, as I've suggested in the reading, if we look at the discussions in the Comintern and amongst European Marxists, Trotsky in particular wrote very perceptively on this point. What we're not talking about are simply ideas. We're talking about a mass movement. We're talking about a movement whose aim is to smash the working class because that working class poses a potential threat to capitalism. We're also talking about a movement that the bourgeoisie can manipulate and can use, and indeed will be quite willing to surrender a degree of political power to that movement in order to carry out that task. So the relationship between capitalism and the ruling class and fascism is very important. And the modern liberal attempt to separate them, I think, really must be resisted. The other key point, of course, is that that movement must be a mass movement. It must rest upon the mobilization of those plebeian, of those petty bourgeois sectors. It cannot simply be an authoritarian movement from above. It cannot simply be a populist or a demagogic leader. Capitalism will use fascism, indeed it will mobilize fascism in a period of crisis. So what we're talking about is not just simply a label, we're talking about a revolutionary period, and above all, the failure of the working class to take power. As many comrades said in the 20s and 30s, the price that the German working class failed to take power was Nazism. That was the capitalist reaction that was, in a sense, their punishment for having failed to overthrow capitalism and to overthrow the reaction when they had that opportunity. But comrades, this is really just a brief introduction, so I'll end now and throw it open to discussion, and we'll see how we go from there. Thanks, comrades.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kevin. I think that was short, but very punchy and with lots of interesting ideas that I think the whole left really needs to discuss, because there is so much confusion on that issue, and Kevin pointed out a few of those. You know, Donald Trump, I mean, is he, you know, can you be a fascist without having a fascist movement behind you, etc.? You know, it's just very interesting ideas, and that it is the capitalism turns to fascism, doesn't it, when it can't rule in the old way. It's not something that's being done against capitalism, which is often also presented to what happened in Germany, etc. You know, some madman took over, etc., and the poor country, including the poor capitalists, were taken over, when in fact it was in the full knowledge of much of the capitalist and ruling class, as a conscious attempt to crush the working class, because the capitalists couldn't do it. They tried in the Weimar Republic for a long time, and it was a very unstable society. So that was a really interesting introduction. Thank you very much, Kevin. We've got a few comrades already with their hands up. What I forgot to mention earlier in the intro, sorry about this, is Kevin has to leave at 7 p.m. sharp. So we're trying to keep contributions a bit shorter than usual if we could. Thanks, comrades. Tony first.
Okay, thank you, Kevin, for a very interesting introduction. Unfortunately, I missed the first 10 minutes of it, so I hope I'm not going to say things which you've already said, and if so, I'm sorry. First, I think it's important to make a differentiation between today and yesterday, and not to imagine that the rise of far-right parties, therefore, it symbolizes necessarily the rise of fascism. We're in very, I think, different circumstances today. I think one of the consistent features of fascism is that it has no coherent ideology. It's eclectic. It borrows from wherever it can, not least the left. I mean, I found that when we were engaged in a particularly ferocious struggle with the National Front in the early 80s, that many of their publications, literature, agitation, propaganda